this roundtable meeting of the African BP. And I hope everyone that is here is hearing me.
Yes,
can I just confirm?
We can hear you loud and clear, Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof. So we're all welcome. And today's meeting has a lot of our partners, and it's also open to the general public. And we'll be engaging a guest speaker who will introduce shortly. And in view of the fact that we have a lot of new persons on the call, we would like to just use some time to be able to give a very brief account of the AfricaBP. So I would like to, before we will introduce our speaker, who is Taukondjo Shikongo, who is the head of Nagoya Protocol Unit of the UNEP CBD. He's already on the call, and he will be talking to us on the topic, the CBD and its protocols, the processes of digital sequence information on the genetic resources in the convention. And before we have him, I would like to welcome Dr. Taukondjo. Dr. Taukondjo Ebenezer is the founder of AfricaBP, and he is a co-chair, currently serving as a co-chair, and he is a bioinformatician who is currently working with the European Bioinformatics Institute. So he will use about 5 minutes to give us a brief account of the AfricaBP before we invite our guest speaker. I hope Taukondjo is ready for that.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kwandong. I would like to welcome us all to the roundtable meeting of the AfricaBP. Because this is this meeting is open to the general public, and there are lots of just a moment, please. Yeah, because this meeting is open to the general public, and there are lots of new people here. I would like to briefly talk about the AfricaBP. So I'm just going to share my slide, and so we'll have a background to the conversation. So can you see my screen, please? Can everyone see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay. How about now?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, so I'll briefly talk about the AfricaBP, and mainly, so I'll just introduce AfricaBP, talk about the progress we've made and the opportunities over the next 5 minutes or 10. So one of the things we aim to do is to try to see how we can use genomic information to prevent biodiversity loss, and more importantly, in agriculture and in conservation. So this graph basically is from the National History Museum, and it shows the biodiversity loss versus intact ecosystems. And of course, as you can see, this is the continent of Africa here. And AfricaBP has 3 main goals. The first is to coordinate all non-human genome sequencing efforts across the continent, act as a forum for the non-human space, initiate, develop, and support all non-human sequencing efforts across the continent, and close the capacity gaps in genomics, bioinformatics, and other aspects that the continent needs capacity in genomics-related activities, and deploy the data generated to, for instance, other agencies, for instance, the African Union Inter-Africa Bureau for Animal Resources. So the project aims to cover all eukaryotic lineages, and the project is, AfricaBP is also affiliated to the BioGenome project. And we are working to look at vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, animals, protozoa, fungi, and insects. So there are mainly 5 grand challenges that we aim to address. The first is the genomics and bioinformatics technologies for the agri-environment. The second is crops and livestock improvement and health. The third is genomics for conservation of endangered species. The fourth is socioeconomics, ethics, and policy. And of course, the fifth is on technology development, knowledge exchange, and industry. And all of this revolves around value proposition and capacity building. So recently in March 2022, we published the position paper of AfricaBP in Nature, and you can also search for it online, where we describe what the core principle is and what we're doing, as well as what the future, we're looking into the future for. And about it, we had about more than 150 news outlets that kind of talked about the press release and also the paper globally. And there are basically 4 programs in AfricaBP that we're developing. The first program is focused on animal genomes. The second is on plant genomes. The third is on the community of practice, which is the meeting we're having now. One of the roundtable meeting is just a part of this program 3, focusing on community of practice biodiversity framework. And the fifth is on capacity buildings, mainly the Open Institute for Genomics and Bioinformatics. And of course, we envisage other opportunities that would come into AfricaBP. And of course, this again revolves around coordination, partnership, policy engagements, and fundraising. So the idea is that we have a 10-year plan, and mainly focusing on when the pilot was launched, the consultations, and also what the pilot trial is all about, and the phase 1. And of course, ultimately over the next 10 years or so, we'll be able to sequence the genomes, basically. So, and again, with the current profile, we'll be talking about AfricaBP at the 77th session of the UN General Assembly. At the chair have been invited, Professor Mugai, and also we're also invited to talk at the Food and Agriculture Organizations of the UN. And this week, just this week, we have AfricaBP delegates speak about AfricaBP at the Africa Union meeting in Zambia. So, and with this, I would like to thank all the members of AfricaBP that have been working in AfricaBP, and many of them based in Africa and others based outside the continent. And there are about 100+ scientists. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taukondjo, for this concise brief about AfricaBP. We will not waste much time, and we'll go ahead to call on our guest speaker to make his presentation. We are free to use between 20 to 30 minutes, and then so that we can have a robust discussion. So you're welcome, Mr. Taukondjo.
Thank you, and good morning, good evening, all. I will share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is, please.
Yes.
Yeah, so as was said, I am Taukondjo Shikongo, the head of the ABS unit in the CBD Secretariat. My task this morning is to address you on the CBD and its protocols, and then with a particular focus on DSI. May I ask that perhaps we close our cameras, and also that we close our microphones, just to allow that there is no feedback, and also that we increase the bandwidth. Having said that, the CBD has 3 objectives, and these objectives are conservation, of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, and then the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the use of such genetic resources. And out of its implementation came the two supplementary protocols. The first one, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, which entered into force in 2004, and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing that entered into force in 2014. All these instruments are the outcome of lengthy negotiations at the international level. The CBD having been negotiated during the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, when the global community met to try and address the pressures that faced the humanity and the planet at that time. I will now move on and focus into the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization to the convention of genetic resources, as well as the associated traditional knowledge. Now, the key objectives of the Nagoya Protocol are to govern access to genetic resources and the associated traditional knowledge of indigenous and local communities, and the sharing of benefits arising from the utilization in a fair and equitable way. And the focus here is on fair and equitable. So in that sense, the Nagoya Protocol is seeking to address social justice regarding the sharing of benefits that arises out of the use of genetic resources. And it aims also to establish more predictable conditions for access to genetic resources through prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms for benefit sharing. And it promotes thus greater legal certainty and transparency for both the provider of genetic resources and the users of genetic resources. That is done including through compliance measures to monitor one, that genetic resources have been accessed in accordance with prior informed consent and that mutually agreed terms. And also then secondly, that utilization of genetic resources, including by designating effective checkpoints at any stage of the value chain, research, development, innovation, pre-commercialization, or commercialization of a genetic resource once it has left its point of origin. And it's asking that at national level, parties establish national focal points and competent national authorities to serve as contact points for information and to grant access or cooperate on issues of compliance. There are a number of noteworthy features around this treaty or this protocol, and I'll just go into one that it is the specialized international access and benefit sharing instrument, and it allows for bilateral ABS requirements of the Nagoya Protocol to be passed. What we are saying here is that the Nagoya Protocol is not the only agency that will be dealing with benefit sharing, and so there's a provision within it to allow for other specialized international access, international agreements to also deal with the issue of access and benefit sharing, such as that we see under WHO, we see that under the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, amongst others. And it has also provided for a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, which is still not operational, and it is still under discussion by the parties. And it has got what we call an ABS clearing house, which enhances legal certainty and transparency on procedures for access and sharing, and for monitoring the utilization of genetic resources along the value chain, including through the internationally recognized certificate of compliance. So this clearinghouse is where parties can share their experiences with the protocol. So why was such a protocol on access and benefit sharing needed? After the conclusion of the CBD and its entry into force, and some time lapsed in terms of its implementation, it became clear that the CBD provisions were not fully implemented. There was a lack of clarity on how prior informed consent is to be done, and then cases of misappropriation of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge were on the increase, and the need for legal certainty and transparency was still there for providers to have concern regarding ensuring benefit sharing once genetic resources have left the provider country, and for the user, the need for clear procedures when accessing genetic resources. Now, this is what led to the negotiation of the treaty, which was then adopted in Nagoya in 2010 after a lengthy, protracted process of parties trying to agree and reach consensus on what to do and why it should be done regarding access and benefit sharing. I will now move to the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. As I said before, it entered into force on 11 September 2003 and currently has 173 parties. The Nagoya Protocol has got 137 parties. The key objectives of the protocol is the safe handling, transport, and use of living modified organisms developed using modern biotechnology, taking also into account risk to human health. Now, as the CBD was being implemented, it became clear that is constantly evolving, and with that, also the need for knowledge and the need for technologies. And so biotechnology and genetic engineering then led to the ability of manipulating genes, and there were concerns about the impact of such technologies, especially the product thereof of living modified organisms on human health, the environment health, and animal health. And that then led to the negotiations on the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. The noteworthy features of this protocol is that it's got a supplementary protocol on liability and redress and then there is also the biosafety clearinghouse, which provides a dynamic platform where information can be easily searched and retrieved thereby. So the liability and redress protocol or supplementary protocol also took a number of years to negotiate, and under the talks as the protocol was being implemented came the issue of synthetic biology. And when that issue arose around 2010, there was the need to consider the potential impacts of components, organisms, and products resulting from synthetic biology techniques on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And a precautionary approach was called for to the field release of synthetic life. And then a technical expert group was commissioned to look into the matter. And we see that then by 2016, there was acknowledged an operational definition of what synthetic biology can be defined as. and considered it useful as a starting point for deliberations. And it also noted that principles and methodologies for risk assessment under the Cartagena Protocol provided a good basis for risk assessment of living modified organisms developed through synthetic biology. From 2018 to 2021, the ARTEC, Adult Technical Experts Group, continued its work and agreed that the horizon scanning of technology development is needed for reviewing potential impacts of the synthetic biology, and again called for a precautionary approach taking into account the current uncertainties regarding engineered gene drives. And these talks are continuing, and so the next round on these talks will be then at COP15. I have a colleague with me here, Marianella, and she is serving in the biosafety unit. And at the question time, if there are more questions in biology, she will be able to handle those. So now, if we take these things together, which are the emerging issues under the CBD, and under the emerging issues, there's of course the technologies, which is the next generation sequencing and gene editing techniques, and as well as artificial intelligence and bioinformatics, engineered gene drives and DNA, RNA circuits, as well as the complex metabolic engineering. All of these issues have an impact on synthetic biology, and of course also digital sequence information, because it is necessary, therefore it is working on the functional units of heredity. And currently under the CBD, we had the 10-year plan, which was the Aichi biodiversity targets, which had from 2011 to 2020, which was the main framework for change that we hope to achieve the 3 objectives of the convention. And as you note, that time frame is over, and the geo outlook of last year pointed out that we haven't done that well. And the world is now holding its breath, looking at the negotiations of a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which has got a 2050 vision where living in harmony with nature is the desired outcome. And so all of this then comes together under the CBD, that we hope we can have then sustainable use, conservation, and sharing of benefits. And then alongside that, Nagoya Protocol to then access to genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their utilization. We believe that the 2 legs, sustainable use and conservation, there's been quite a lot of focus onto that, whereas the implementation on the 3rd objective has been somewhat lacking. And alongside that is the Cartagena Protocol to then assure the safe handling, transport, and use of LMOs resulting from modern biotechnology that may have adverse effects on biodiversity and human health. And then that has to be regulated through national laws and regulations, and hopefully that balance will lead to communities and consumers continuing, and of course the world community continuing to benefit from biodiversity and what it is to offer in terms of sustaining our livelihood on this planet. But at the same time, there is also the industries that are being fed by these emerging technologies that arises, of course, out of the use of biological diversity. And as you can see, it's quite substantial. Now, that brings us then to a sort of a conclusion on the first part of our talk. We've got the CBD that covers organisms, products, and components of synthetic biology. And then the CBD discussions on that are focusing on the positive and negative impacts from synthetic biology. Whereas the Cartagena Protocol, which is focused on living modified organisms produced through modern biotechnology, is focusing on the negative impacts of the synthetic biology. And then the Nagoya Protocol is looking at the use of DSI and how it's covered. And this is covered under both the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. But for the Nagoya Protocol, it is to look, and the CBD, it is to consider what do we do with the benefits that are being generated through the use of DSI. So what is DSI? This term itself is a placeholder term, while parties discuss the substantive concept and come to an agreement of what that constitutes. So there is, to date, no internationally agreed meaning, and it is not the only term that is being used. WHO has got their own way of using it, and there are also currently negotiations under the BBNJ, out of the beyond national jurisdiction, especially on the high seas, and there another division is in place. The treaty may also have their own definition on that. And as I've said, this then emerged in CBD discussion COP13 on synthetic biology, and it refers to information on the basic building blocks of life. And in 2018, the Conference of the Parties, the 14th one, recognized the importance of digital sequence information for the three objectives of the CBD, and that access to and use of DSI contributes to scientific research, as well as to other non-commercial and commercial activities. And that further capacity to access, use, generate, and analyze DSI will be needed or is needed in many countries. And that led then to a divergence of views among parties regarding the benefit sharing from the use of DSI. And they committed to working towards resolving this divergence through a step-by-step process established in Decision 14/20. Now, this is a diagrammatic outlook of that process starting in 2018, where we had two decisions, one under the CBD 14/20 and one under the Nagoya Protocol conference of the parties, or meeting of the parties, the third meeting, Decision 12. And the step-by-step process then kicked off with an ad hoc technical expert group that had to carry out studies and look at some views and come up with recommendations on what can be done with this issue of DSI. And they then had to fit into the information from there had to fit into the open-ended working group on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Because what the parties have asked is that after the ad hoc technical expert group has considered this issue, it will not go to the body that is dealing with the technical and technological issues and scientific issues, but rather it will go to this working group that is developing the post-2020 global biodiversity outlook about the framework. And this working group met twice between 2021 and 2022. And so it considered the issue, and it has then to send its recommendations to COP15 and Nagoya Protocol meeting of the parties, the fourth one. That also took place in two parts, in October last year, and then to conclude when we have a date for that. Alongside this formal process was the co-chairs informal process, which was necessitated from around 22, given the pandemic that put everything on hold. So if we look into the outcome of the ad hoc technical expert group on DSI, they had 4 studies, and they had to look at the concept and scope of DSI. How should it be defined, and should such a definition have a broad scope, and what would be the implications of that? And then traceability in terms of tracing the digital sequence information when you encounter it somewhere, and tracing it back from where it came from, and tracking it, meaning that you from country or the provider or the origin, you can track it along the value chain. And then, of course, this is housed in databases. What are those databases? What are the rules around them? And then to answer the question, are there currently domestic policy measures that are regulating the issue of DSI? And then parties were also requested to submit their views. And so there is a synthesis of views from parties and other international fora on their views on digital sequence information. And then they developed options for operational terms and identified key areas for capacity building for DSI. If we go a bit into the concept and scope, the ARTEC found 4 clearly defined groups that would assist negotiators, and these groups are there is the DNA, there is the RNA, there is the proteins, and then there is the metabolites and other macromolecules. But they also acknowledge that there is, you can say, a 5th group, which includes the traditional knowledge that is associated with genetic resources, as well as the ecological interactions, because there is acknowledgement of the fact that indigenous and local communities, by virtue of their sustained coexistence with biodiversity in their specific biogeographical areas, have contributed to what we see today as biodiversity through their interactions. And that contribution should also be therefore somehow recognized. And so then out of that, the ARTEC agreed that these 3 groups can be considered as DSI. The first one is a much narrower scope that you just, group 1 is therefore just the DNA and the RNA. Group 2 is the DNA, the RNA, and the proteins. And group 3 is then the DNA, RNA, proteins, metabolites, and other macromolecules that would be associated with that particular digital sequence information. So then we, given the pandemic and that parties could not meet, the co-chairs of the post-2020 Global Framework initiated the informal process to maintain momentum on the issue and to further elucidate some of the issue. And we then had 4 webinar series. The first one was to the understanding of DSI, to have a technical overview of its production, its distribution, and use, using the outcome of the ARTEC as the basis for these webinars. Having done that, the first webinar, the second webinar looked at the process and recent outcomes related to DSI under the CBD. And the third webinar considered policy options for ABS and DSI that emanates from the state of art that came out of the ARTEC. And then after that, it became clear that there may be a need for criteria to consider these policy options on DSI in terms of their practicality, efficiency, etc. And an online forum was also created, which was open to all. And it's important to know that other informal webinars, activities, and dialogues took place in parallel to this. So to date, we have these policy options that have came out of the process. To understand it, on my left-hand side, we will have, when we consider the policy options, we came up with sort of the framework within which one can consider them. And it's to ask, is access to DSI regulated or not regulated? Is there prior informed consent or no prior informed consent? Is there mutually agreed terms or no mutually agreed terms? And then on the other side, that you consider against is if access is regulated and there is prior informed consent and there is mutually agreed terms, that can happen under a bilateral mechanism, and therefore tracing of country of origin is possible, and therefore benefit sharing linked to DSI data is possible. However, if there is no access is not regulated, for instance, in a case where you do not know what was the provider country of that genetic resource from which the DSI came from, then there is no one to negotiate the pick and mud, and there is no one with whom to negotiate the mutually agreed terms, and therefore a bilateral option becomes not possible, and one has to consider then a multilateral mechanism, and then so there is no tracing of country of origin, and the benefit sharing therefore will not be linked to the DSI data. So option one, thus taking these broad parameters, is that the status quo, option 0, then is that the status quo remains, that divergence remains regarding benefit sharing from the use of DSI, that we do not know whether we should share benefit from DSI. That's the first option, and that we just then leave it at that. The option 1 then is that DSI can be fully integrated into domestic ABS measures, and DSI will be subject to each party's ABS legislation, which means it's bilateral, the bilateral mechanism comes into place. Then there is option 2.1, which is that there could be a standard material transfer agreement or license at national level, and each party establishes its own policy system. 2.2 could be that there is a standard material license at the international level, and parties adopt one or more internationally standardized material transfer agreements. And then the third option is that there is payment for access to DSI or payment for access to the sequence itself. And when that happens, you can see that it is already entering the multilateral mechanism option. There could be other payments and contributions, such as agreement with external entities on payment for services, levy bonds, etc. And the fourth one is that enhanced technical and scientific capacity and cooperation which is a systematic and mandated capacity development for developing countries, can also be seen as a benefit sharing under a multilateral mechanism where it's not possible to trace countries of origin. And then option 5 is simply to say there will be no benefit sharing from DSI. There is international agreement that no explicit benefit sharing is necessary from the use of DSI. And you'll see that those two options have no color there, it's color white. Through the process so far, it seems that parties are clear that option 0 and option 5 is not a desired option. And then it leads us to option 6, which came later, that there could be a 1% levy on retail sales of genetic resources, payment on retail sales into a multilateral mechanism. That option was then put forward later in the process. So all of that then led us to the first, the working group on the post-2020 global health framework. And the outcomes from this ARTEC and the informal activities were then recognized in the third meeting of the working group. And then they said that those policy, not that they just took note of it, and they also then put in place an informal co-chairs advisory group to look into these issues further. And that group developed an analytical framework for assessment of the policy options. and it looked at areas of convergence and divergence regarding these policy options. And the co-chairs of the post-22 working group also requested the Secretariat to commission an independent review and application of the framework, and that work is in its initial stages. Here is just a snapshot of these performance matrix or these assessment criteria and sub-criteria. We have put the options there on the one scale, and then the criteria on the other scale. Is it effective in achieving its policy goals? It's sufficient and feasible to implement? Does it enable good governance? Is it coherent and adaptable? So then we had the third meeting of the working group, which took place in March in Geneva. And this group agreed, the working group agreed to recommendation working group 2023/2. And the notable points that came out, which can be seen as a positive outcome, is that it recognizes that the solution on benefit sharing for DSI should, amongst others, be efficient, feasible, and practical, generate more benefits, both monetary and non-monetary, than cost, be effective, provide certainty and legal clarity for providers, and not hinder research and innovation, be consistent with open access to data, and not be incompatible with international legal obligations, be mutually supportive of other ABS instruments, also take into account the rights of indigenous people and local communities, and then request the results of the assessment of the policy options to be also given to 15. So it identified a number of issues that needed further work, and that those issues were definition, scope of DSI, tracking and tracing, roles of stakeholders, arguing that we need to, or parties have to allow all concerned stakeholders to also pronounce them on this issue, and then the roles of IPLCs in these modalities, and whether hybrid options, meaning that a combination of both multilateral and bilateral, can be considered, the legal feasibility of these policy options, and an update on the policy appraisal process. So it also has got a draft decision for COP15, but it's all in brackets for now. So the informal advisory group continued to work and concluded its work last week, Thursday. And there has been additional points of convergence that has come out of this work. And this slide provides a quick summary of that. And to run through that, it's that tracking and tracing could be used for a limited specialized subset of DSI, but it's not feasible currently, technically or financially at a large scale. A solution on DSI is likely to include a multilateral mechanism. The pooling of data benefits research and innovation and brings mutual benefits to the research and database communities. And the future proofing of a solution on DSI could be achieved through a combination of legal simplicity, a well-considered scope of DSI, including synthetic biology. Since DSI came out of synthetic biology itself was not being really mentioned within the discussion, but it now came up that for future proofing, it's important to consider it, as well as the feasibility and practicality of the solution in the face of future technological change, because we must accept that research and development and technology is advancing so fast and dynamically that capturing it in one policy statement may be counterintuitive, and therefore future proofing may be needed, and that the flexible system of governance or the priorities and modalities for benefit sharing should be considered. And technical operational feasibility of the policy solution needs further consideration, and not only the legal feasibility. They also found that the Convention on Biological Diversity provides a very good framework for a solution on DSI, given that it is near universal in terms of membership, and several of its provisions could be leveraged to support a solution on DSI. That leaves us with the fourth meeting of the post-2020 working group, which is starting next week. And in that meeting, the negotiators would, the mandate is that they continue to work on the basis of the draft decision that came out of Geneva, and then also take into account the outcomes that I've just provided to you. And these outcomes are also now already on our website. There is an information document on the work of the IAC, and there is a note from the secretary to the parties on the work from on the outcomes from the IAC. And so what are the expectations of this working group 2020, the fourth one? It will pick up where it left off in Geneva, both for agenda items 4 on the post-2020 global powers framework and on agenda item 5, which is digital sequence information, and produce recommendation to the COP15, which is the mandate working group. And further documentation for that meeting is on that on our website. To date, we have 1,400 participants that have pre-registered for the meeting next week, of which 811 will be on site and 590 will be for virtual participation from 112 parties and 185 observer organizations. At this point, nearing the end of my presentation, it is just to say that all of this work on the post-2020 target framework is to hopefully engineer or usher in a transformative change in the way we deal with life across the planet for our future existence. And the concern is not for us here present today, but what will be the fate of 7 generations from now? And therefore, as the wise elders, ancestors have said, the earth is not ours, it is a treasure that we hold in trust for those that will come after us. Can we be the change individually and collectively that is required to transform and help us to help the planet and thereby help us all? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Shikongo. I like the closing statement. Our future is not for us today, and what will be the future of the future generations that we are leaving behind. I think on that note, we want to appreciate you, and I believe our participants have listened carefully, and I'm sure there are questions or contributions that our participants would like to bring up. I will also advise that if you can also just drop the messages or the comments on the chat box so that we can still manage the time that we have for the discussion. On that note, I would like to open up for the discussion. And before then, a quick one, Mr. Shikongo, there is a request. We want to know whether you will be happy to share your slides.
Yeah, we will send it to you.
Good. So please, you can just drop your emails on the chat box so that we can address it, so that once he shares it, we can forward it to all the participants. So on that note, I would like to take up comments. You can indicate by raising up raise of hand.
I think we'll say Dr. Diaga Diop.
Thank you very much, and congratulations for the speaker. It was very, very Very excellent. I am Jagajuf. I am from Senegal. My question is about.
Sorry, Professor Geoff. Do you just want to tell us, what you do or something, maybe like the position and the institution you are? Because that would also help AfricaBP.
Okay, I am a professor of plant molecular genetics, and I am in University Cheikh Anta Diop of Dakar. Can I go for my question?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Dakar,
yeah, thank you very much. And my question is related to the DSI. Among your suggestions, I think that you talk about the access to the DCI. My question is, how can you handle this kind of thing? Like you are talking about accessing of whole genome sequence or accessing to every kind of sequence as small as it is. And the second question is, what will be the benefit if accessing to the DSI is, we have to pay, for example, to access to the DSI. What will be the benefit of the people who are submitting their sequence in the website? The third question is related to the, I think we have to make a distinction, a difference between who is using the DSI to make benefit, to make profit, and who is using the DSI for education or for just generating knowledge. I think if people who are in the poor country have to pay to access to the DSI for research, I think it will be impacted negatively the progress of research in the poor country. It was my question, please.
Are there perhaps other questions?
Yeah, I think we're going to take the questions one by one, Mr. Shikongo.
All right. So I can proceed?
Yes, please.
Well, the professor is asking as to how to handle access to DSI, and then also zooms in terms of the benefits, the benefits that are accruing from such access, and the concern that if access is restricted, how that would impact on those users in developing countries, and also the implications of that for research, for researchers, innovation, and knowledge generation. Well, those are also the concerns of many of the parties, open access, and so therefore they have as a principle that open access should be fostered, and that it should not stifle research, innovation, and knowledge generation. And the whole question is, when DSI is accessed and benefits are generated, should those benefits be shared or not? And that's the whole nexus or focus of this process, to determine if benefits are to be shared, what modality should be used how that be enforced at the international or national level. And so it is, you also know that in the presentation, the parties have said that it must be, the process must be inclusive and bring forward also the views of other stakeholders. So in the IAC, we had researchers, database managers, private sector in terms of the various subsectors of that use DSI or use DSI as a service provider for them to pronounce themselves on exactly the kind of questions that you are asking. Of course, as a secretariat, we have no position as to what is the best way or the other way. That is for the parties to then to pronounce themselves based on what we have presented here. They will continue to look at it and then come up with a solution that hopefully will address the concerns you have. And it is for you then to, through the channels, contact, organize yourself and contact the focal point at national level, and or to then provide them with your views on what that policy solution should look like in the end, that does not impact in your sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shikongo. I think there are many more questions. Professor Emmanuel, just before, because I know this is going to the top of the hour, though we have the meeting is for 90 minutes. We could just maybe break a bit and take like a screenshot or photo on before we come back to answer the questions. So Professor Kondong, what do you think?
I think it's okay.
Okay, so maybe we can just, if everyone kind of just put on their videos, then we can we'll then resume just shortly after the pictures have been taken.
Yeah.
Done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone have additional questions or comments? So
I think
question
Diaga Diouf raised his hand earlier. I don't know whether he has stepped down.
I'm sorry?
So, Professor Diouf, we're asking if you're satisfied with the response, or the responses rather.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Thank you very much.
So I think for me, Mr. Shikongo, one question is why? What are the challenges, or why is this DSI why can't it easily go into access and benefit sharing regulations or mechanism that govern the ABS, the Nagoya Protocol? Because sometimes I think about it, though I understand that there are multiple reasons and also multiple opinions, but why can't this easily go into that framework that is existing? Because the genetic resource is part of all of that. So what are the bottlenecks, please?
Thank you for that question. There are a number of reasons why that is, and it is around the divergence that the parties has. So when the issue arose, there was the core divergence whether does the concept genetic resource in the CBD cover DSI or not, and then whether DSI should fall under the ABS regime, and if it does, then it will be governed by a bilateral mechanism, which is then between two parties. And whether open access to DSI can be regarded as a sufficient form of benefit sharing, more or less along the question that Professor Diouf asked, whether, another way of saying, well, if you have access to DSI, that's a good benefit for you, because DSI is kept in a database paid for by a few and made available to the many. And therefore, that should be enough. Don't ask for anything in addition to that. And then there is also the larger question then as to the post-2020 framework, whether it will address the three objectives of the CBD in a balanced manner, taking into account that parties feel that benefits sharing has not been done adequately or implemented adequately. There are also other articles such as technology transfer that has not been worked on that much. And therefore, what role should ABS play within the post-2020 framework? And linked to that, the link between ABS, DSI, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and how DSI and especially benefit sharing will be addressed in the context of the post-2020 global policy framework. So there are many issues that have been put forward by the parties on which they're not clear, and they then have to pronounce themselves on that and find the most appropriate, feasible and practical solution as to how to deal with the issue of sharing benefits from arising from DSI. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other question, please, or comment?
Maybe again, if we have, because this meeting is also involved the ABS National Focal Persons for Africa, the National Focal Persons for the Global Environment Facility, the Cartagena Protocol, and the CBD as well. So if there are others here, I think it would be nice to, again, maybe know people's opinion and things. Because I do know that Dr. Fikmere of the ABS person for Ethiopia, in the last time he was asking a question, trying to look at, okay, if what happens to the DSI obtained from samples, for instance, that have potentially or in the past left the country of origin before most of this come into force. Are there provisions in the ongoing conversations to cover some of those points as well?
Yes, and just to, before I answer that one, just to note that if there are questions on synthetic biology and how it is being handled under the BioGenome protocol, my colleague Marianella is also in the call, and she can take Quentin's questions on that. Now, with that question, when you look at the definition and scope and how it applies to the CBD, of course, the CBD is set within a temporal scope, which is the 1992. And under international treaty, you cannot have retroactive action. So, which means that anything that goes beyond 1992 may not be included in the scope of the CBD. Then there is also the issue of sovereignty, and then there are the issue of what happens to biodiversity that is beyond national jurisdictions, such as in the open seas, high seas, and all of that. So what happens to those? And where there is where you cannot say it came from this country or that country, there is no provider. With whom do you then go into an agreement? And that is why parties are proposing the multilateral mechanism, where you cannot, in cases where you cannot clearly say who was the provider. So that if parties opt for a narrow scope, then it may have implications on the answer to the question. If there is a broader scope, it may also have an answer to that question. So those are the type of practical scenarios that must be considered in terms of addressing this issue in policy solution.
Thank you, Mr. Shikongo. I'm going to pass on to Professor Emmanuel Kondog to know if there are any more questions. Professor Kondog, over to you, please.
There is a question in text in the chat box, Sangha.
Okay, I'm just seeing a question here.
Please give your question.
Yeah, so I think
the question, what is, his question is directed at the steering committee. Could you please explain how do African countries which has not yet access to benefit this AfricaBP, how can they benefit and get access in terms of capacity development and get access in terms of capacity development, legislation, or improvement? Tango, can you quickly take that?
Yeah, so basically, there are two ways by which this can. So Professor Emmanuel, do you want to mute, please? I think that would, yeah. So there are two ways by which this could help, potentially. We have the African BP Open Institute for Genomics and Bioinformatics, which I talked about earlier on. And the main purpose of that is to build capacity and knowledge exchange. And within that program, we're doing workshop and training and everything capacity, especially when it comes to the science and helping to disseminate the information. So one way to actually build that capacity at the national level or at each of the African countries is for your institutions to be part of this Open Institute. We had the first workshop last month, and we have a number of African scientists, join, and there are ongoing efforts to reproduce the first genomes that have been sequenced, because that is one way to actually help in that process. So that is number one. Number two, okay, how can they benefit in terms of legislation development or improvement? So one way is through this meeting we are having, the roundtable meeting. That evolved because we realized that the African BioGenome project will actually involve, going to sequencing genome, sampling, and there are so many things that are required, ethical MET, MAT, and other permits. So we feel that one of the best ways is to have monthly meetings whereby we discuss with the national focal persons, APS, GF, Cartagena Protocol, CBD, invite them to talk at, what they are doing at their own national levels. And then we could see how that would help the broader goals of the AfricaBP. And again, in doing that, we hope that AfricaBP will be able to produce the data-driven evidence in terms of the genomes, African endemic species, that can be used to further engage this conversation. And hopefully that will help the legislation improvement and other aspects. And more importantly, and finally, is that this week, 2 days ago, there are delegates of the AfricaBP in Zambia who attended, they were invited to speak at the Africa Union meeting, basically. And again, all of this involves around how can AfricaBP work with other agencies and continental agencies to be able to help with policy and legislation and other aspects of the project. So there are the two aspects or two ways I think this could basically help. Professor Kwandong, over to you, please.
All right, thank you. Quickly, we'll take a question from Betty while Dr. Samantaga, you also hold on. Immediately after Betty, we'll go to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to the moderator and the panelists. My question is an extension of the previous question that was asked with regards to what happens to a genetic resource if it has left the country before the protocol came into force. Our understanding is that we do not apply the law retroactively. However, where there is, and I need guidance and education on this, our understanding is that even though we don't apply the law retroactively, that we do focus on new and continuous use. And my understanding is that DSI, wherever it is applied continuously or newly applied, should be an issue to be addressed in terms of benefit sharing. If that is not the understanding, then I stand to be corrected and further guided in order to understand how exactly the process of not applying the law retrospectively, but focusing on new and continuous use need to be inculcated into the implementation of this protocol. Thank you so much, including our legislations.
Yeah. Thank you, Betty. One of the things we encourage, so I'm going to let Mr. Shikongo respond, but we do encourage that people who ask questions maybe talk about, just mention which country they are calling from and which institution, because that would also help us see how we can better reach out to people. So
and the ABS focal point from Namibia.
Oh, Namibia. Thank you, Betty. Okay, over to you, Mr. Shikongo, please.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing out the new and continued use issue. That is, of course, there, that if there are any new uses or continued, then benefits can be accessed. And that is why I have said the issue here is to look at the benefits that arises from the use of DSI. Will they be handled in a bilateral manner where you can then say that it is the origin is clear, or will they be handled in a multilateral manner? Because if you go for a multilateral mechanism, then the issue of new and continued use become mute, because all that comes into play is the fact that somebody has accessed DSI and therefore benefits, whatever use of DSI benefits must be shared. And in that, I believe that issue is then captured. And that is why this issue is arising out of synthetic biology discussions that led to DSI synthetic biology being a new use of biodiversity as we know it. Thank you.
Okay, Brighton, can you go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for this presentation and information that you provided to us. I have a rather, might be a little bit broader than question. It might even touch on maybe things that were discussed, but probably I wasn't present. But I think it's a question that has bothered me, or I haven't really managed to really wrap around on what really, how to go about it. The whole theme about with all these different, I think, aspects that we're dealing with is sort of benefit sharing. I'm wondering how equitable, probably based on your historical experience or others that are present here, has this sharing been? Is it a good faith approach, or is it like enshrined in mechanisms of manner that whereby if somebody uses your material, makes a paper, does a patent, there's maybe 2 more researchers that use that same paper to make more patents. Do you have access to benefit from those patents or not? Or I'm trying to say, how much do we think Africans we can actually benefit from the information we put out there? Or do we really have the mechanisms to actually make sure when people don't play by the same rules, we can still recover something?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Samatanga. Before Mr. Shikongo responds, just tell us which country you're from and what's the position. And
So Professor Brighton Samatanga, the Biotech Institute, African National Point, and ABP National Focal Point for Zimbabwe.
All right. Thank you, Professor Samatanga. Yeah. Mr. Shikongo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I would retrace again what I said, that the whole issue of the Nagoya Protocol came to the fore when parties realized that the objective of the CBD, the third objective, is not being addressed in a systematic manner, which is the first one is conservation, second one is use of biodiversity, third one is benefit sharing. So access was granted, but benefits were not coming forth. And if we go back in history to Rio, where all this started, that was the grand bargain, that access as a, when you access something, then there will be, through prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, there will be then benefits accruing. And so that issue led to, when parties realized that it's not happening, then they negotiated the bond guidelines, which were voluntary. And it means parties can choose to use them or not. And they then felt that that is not strong enough. And in the World Summit in Rio, the Rio Summit, which took place in South Africa, I think 2002, their parties agreed to look or work towards an international regime that could be legally binding. And that led then to the Nagoya Protocol. And the Nagoya Protocol, as we have it, takes care of a bilateral approach. And it's got Article 10, which is asking for a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, but discussions on that has not concluded. And so the question you are asking, though, is not a question that Secretariat can answer. That is a question that Africa must answer for itself, and that the practitioners, the stakeholders, the communities, the researchers, educators, and the governments must consider and say, well, are benefits really accruing? And if they accrue, to whom do they accrue? Do they stay at the national level? Do they go to the local level? to the custodians of biodiversity, the communities out there, and is the social justice and equity provision that is ingrained in the CBD really being complied with? And if not, what can be done? Why? If yes, what can be done? Why? That is not a question that I can answer, or that should be answering, but that you yourself should consider.
Okay, thank you. We have another hand up. Bago Bulen, can we take you quickly so that we can?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good presentation, though we are a bit short-sighted in it. What's important in this presentation today is the issue of fulfilling the three objectives in terms of intellectual rights. You find this in most countries, the genetic resources are being traded, and there's no clear laws which are regional or something networking, so that it can help different countries in the issue of intellectual rights in terms of genetic trade, resource trade. So with this forum, maybe it's the right forum to ask now, how can the different countries' legislation process support the issue of intellectual rights so that it can bring about sharing of benefit and equity in terms of genetic resource trade?
Yeah, so before Mr. Shikongo answers, Mr. Bago Bulian, could you please tell us which country you're from and which institutes, or if you are the ABS National Focal Point? Or
yes,
GL?
I'm from South Sudan.
Okay, thank you.
What I'm hearing in the question is regarding intellectual property rights protection and the benefits that comes from that. But though relevant to the discussion, the issue of intellectual rights for protection is covered by WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Rights Organization. And there is, of course, the WTO agreement also that has some trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights that may have impact on that. Again, we are not in a position to answer that, and it's a question for the forum to consider and see what they can do there. What is coming out is the issue, perhaps, of regional harmonization of legislation, so that they speak to each other for the various sub-regions of the continent, and maybe also regional coordination and regional sharing of good practices through such mechanism. But that is for you to consider, and for you on this platform then to see what you do going forward and why you would do that, taking into account my concluding remarks that whatever we do, it's all about sustaining life and the ability for us to have a livelihood security for ourselves and all those co-inhabitants that we live with on this planet, 7 generations from now and beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would just like to take note. Do we have any national focal point representatives on the call other than those that have introduced themselves? Could you just identify yourself if you're on this call and you are a national focal point representative?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kondog. I think that is very important and helpful. So national focal point, either the assets and benefit sharing, one, or the Global Environment Facility through, for Africa mainly. So if you're an African national focal point for the ABS or Global Environment Facility or the Cartagena Protocol or the Convention on Biological Diversity, yeah, please just raise up your hands. That would also help. And Professor
So
Kondo
I can see,
yeah.
I can see Melek. Do you have, okay, Brighton, we already know you, Brighton.
So I'm Melik Shel from Institut Pasteur de Tunis, Tunisia. So actually I represent IPT in the AfricaBP project and a contact point of this project.
Yeah, I think we can say toss you, Eric. Eric, do you wanna, you had your hands raised up?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon for the next presentation. I'm Beninese. I'm Doctor on Agricultural Entomology. I'm Beninese. I follow this presentation. That is good presentation, but I don't know the national focus point for Benin. And if it's possible, you can direct me for that person and I can discuss previously with that kind of the person. Thank you.
Thank you, Tosu. I can see that we have Khalif Dalma, Professor Emmanuel. He said he's the national focal point for the Cartagena Protocol from Somalia.
Okay. So please, we'll be engaging you in our roundtable meetings in the future. And please, if you receive our invitations, please respond so that you can share your experiences with us.
Yeah.
I think on this note,
Professor just to add, to support what you're saying.
God, yes.
Yeah, so to everyone, we organize these meetings monthly to understand what is required at the national level. So, and this meeting comprises of the national focal point for the access and benefit sharing of the Nagoya Protocol, that is one. Then 2, national focal points for the Global Environment Facility. And 3, the CBD national focal points and the Cartagena national focal point. So the idea is to, through this forum, engage the African national focal point. So, and we usually have it on every 3rd Thursday of the month at 1 p.m. GMT+1. And in next month, we'll also have another speaker, maybe from Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, Northern or Western Africa or Central Africa, depending who is available to speak. And they can share their experiences at the national level and also see how they can take the discussions here back to their institutions. Over to you, Professor Nkondo, please. Professor Kwondok, I think you're talking, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Still on mute.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank God. And our guest speaker, we can't thank you enough for sharing these experiences. And I believe all our participants, with the kind of interaction we had, is the testament of how engaging your presentation was. And we will harvest the email addresses of those that have indicated interest and will send his presentations to you. So please feel free to join us in the next month's roundtable meeting when we send the invitations. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.